Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. And this is episode 48.
Social media platforms were created with the promise of allowing us to socialize better and socialize more. And we actually don't know if they are actually accomplishing that function. And I suspect not, considering that we're not getting any of the effects that we get from in-person social interactions in a social media platform.
Social media has become nearly inseparable from our daily lives, and we're left to wonder, is it truly making us feel more connected? Or is it quietly eroding our well-being? Twitter/X, one of the most influential platforms, serves as a microcosm of the broader social media landscape, where benefits like a sense of belonging clash with downsides like increased polarization and diminished mental health. In today's episode, we're taking a look at the complex psychological effects of Twitter use, guided by someone whose research is shedding new light on the ways our online interactions shape our offline lives.
My name is Victoria Oldemburgo de Mello. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at the University of Toronto in Canada. I was born and raised in Brazil. I also attended college in Brazil. During my undergraduate studies, I also spent some time at Harvard doing some research as an intern. And then right after that, I went to grad school for psychology here in Toronto. I guess largely I'm interested in how people are affected by technology. So in what different ways people come to interact with technology and what is the consequence of interacting with technology in those different ways. And I like to use this broad term technology because although the research that I've just recently published is on social media, I'm also very interested in AI and its ramifications.
Victoria's work is especially relevant because it doesn't just stop at identifying problems. It also explores the role of user behavior and motivation, offering practical advice for how we can navigate these platforms more mindfully. Her insights are crucial for anyone looking to better understand the true impact of social media on our mental well-being. So if you've ever wondered whether your time on Twitter is helping or hurting you, this episode is a must-listen. Stay tuned as we uncover the truths behind the tweets and discover how we can all use social media more intentionally. Oh, I'm going to get it wrong. Victoria Oldemburgo de Mello. Thank you so much for making time for our little show.
That's perfect. That's great. Yeah, no worries.
So this paper was pretty interesting to me, and it seemed different than a lot of the other things. I mean, I look at a lot of research papers, and this one, kind of had a different twist to it to actually look, like you say, you see a lot of, William Brady's work and others, kind of talk about some of these kind of correlations, but this one really seemed to dive into it pretty directly, that was the one place you looked at sort of these negative societal effects of particularly in this case it was Twitter/X, but it likely applies to other social media too. At least that would be my guess. But so I wonder if we're going to get some people going to say, well, correlation is not causation and all that. So can you just tell us a little bit about, elaborate maybe on the potential mechanisms behind this correlation and do we think it's the content itself or more about kind of how people use it?
Okay, that's a great question to start out with, because I definitely think, considering what some people have been writing about this paper, that people are getting the causal story a little bit wrong about this. So my study design is such that participants answer in the same survey one question about whether they have used Twitter in the past 30 minutes and what they have done on Twitter. And then they also self-report their current levels of well-being, polarization, sense of belonging, etc. So the kinds of correlations that I'm drawing is whether people have used Twitter in the past 30 minutes or so and how they're feeling right now. And so because of this 30-minute delay between like using Twitter or not, which is I'm not even actually sure if it's 30 minutes ago or even less than that because I asked like at least 30 minutes ago. Um, and so although there's like a temporal difference that would allow me to infer some causality in there, it's still a very correlational analysis. And so in one of my analysis that I like to highlight to talk about causality, for instance, is the relationship between Twitter use and boredom. Because I don't know to what degree people are opening Twitter because they are bored and they just continue to be bored after they have used Twitter for a while, or if they use Twitter and they become bored. And so while I do have some temporal difference that allows me to understand how those things are happening throughout time, I don't actually know the causal story in there. And thus my results are also very correlational in nature, if that makes sense.
Well, and so does that mean we could say the people that are, you know, have sort of have impact on their well-being, or have a, I don't know I don't know the best way to say it, but these well-being considerations, are we sort of saying they might have had them before and they went on Twitter?
Yeah, I'm saying that I can definitely not say for sure what's the direction of this relationship. Because also one thing I would like to highlight about my research is that we made sure to understand the context in which people were using Twitter. And what I mean by context is what motivated you to open Twitter at a specific time point, and what kind of behaviors did you do on Twitter? Did you tweet? Did you retweet something? Did you just scroll down and feed? And it seems that the more passive is the usage. So if you open it because you're frustrated with your work and you just want to, get your mind off of it, um, then you get more detrimental effects. So, I mean, the relationship is stronger. This is what I mean. And so it's possible that the moods that people have when they go on Twitter influence the relationship that they have with Twitter in that specific way.
Hmm. Well, right, and so I'm gonna get into that a little bit more later as well about sort of maybe there's sort of a what I also found at this day there was sort of like a there's a place where we have some action we can take in this. We have a part in this and maybe how we use these services. So we'll make sure we talk about that a little bit more. But before I jump there, I wanted to ask, did you with this? Did you find any surprise? Was there anything that particularly was surprising in the findings for you?
Oh yeah, I would say a lot of things. Um, For one, I did not expect to find any relationships with political polarization because I thought the polarization, at least changes in polarization, usually happen in such a large scale that I just didn't think I could observe them in my study. Not to say that people are getting more polarized because it could also be that maybe when people are on Twitter, they get like this momentarily boost in polarization, and maybe 5 minutes later, they're also not that much polarized anymore. Uh, but that was surprising to me. Also, the null results that I have for anxiety were surprising to me because I thought that, I mean, given the amount of negative information that we are exposed to on Twitter, I would have guessed that Twitter use would be related to anxiety. And at least in my sample, that was not the case. Um, so yeah, and then I guess there are other things that are not as straightforward as this. And then maybe we can talk more about this later. But in one of the choices that I made to analyze my data, I divided the variances into within subjects and between subjects. So basically, how much of those changes are explained by how one person feels before and after they are on Twitter versus how much of those changes can be explained by people who use Twitter more on average. So like between people differences. Um, and I was really surprised that for some of my variables, although like for most variables, it was true that we found within subject changes, which gives us a little bit more support that we're actually telling like a temporal story, something that approaches causality a little bit more, although like I'm hesitant to use that word a little bit. But we also found some interesting between subjects relationships, such as with boredom and loneliness. And what those relationships mean is that people who are, on average, more bored or more lonely also, on average, use Twitter more. And that was a little bit surprising to me, especially in the case of loneliness, because for loneliness, we only found a relationship at the between subjects level and not at the within subjects level.
Elaborate on that just a little bit. What do you think the implications of that are?
So I think my main goal with this research was definitely trying to get at the within subject differences. So what actually happens or what covariates with Twitter use. But I think there might be some more stable traits that that correlate with Twitter use. So imagine if you are a person that on average is more neurotic. Although that's not necessarily a great example because I did analyze personality and I only found no results. But let's imagine another latent variable that explain loneliness, for instance. And then it doesn't even have to be like a personality variable. Let's say that, for instance, people who are more socially isolated, who have less friends, they probably are gonna rate themselves as more lonely. And to some degree, it's also possible, at least according to my data, that these people use Twitter more on average. So this is what I mean by those relationships and why I found them so interesting because I did not expect that at all.
Hmm. Yeah, and well, it also speaks to a lot of the sort of nuance in your research there's different. I mean, it's not easy to just find a nice direct arrow from thing A to thing B sort of thing. But so it shows that the relationships are, at least I take away, and you can say if I'm wrong on this, but a takeaway that I got is that it's a fairly complicated relationship going on here.
Yeah, yeah. Some things happening. Yeah. I mean, the considering how many relationships I found at the two different levels of analysis, and considering that some of the relationships were only true at one level. So, for instance, for well-being, that was only true at the within subject level, but not at all at the between. And for loneliness, it was only true at the between subject level. It's really interesting because it seems that different processes are going on and explaining those relationships at different levels.
Let's explain that terminology just a little bit. The within and between.
Okay, okay. So when I mean within subject, I mean that the kind of comparison that I'm drawing is me and myself in the past. So
Sort
how
of a
is Vic
before and after kind of thing.
yeah, before and after kind of thing. So how happy is Victoria now compared to how she was 30 minutes ago? And when I mean between subjects, I mean how's Victoria compared to David? So this is what I mean. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. So, a lot of the talk about social media that's been going on for quite a while is sort of often focused on sort of structural things and the algorithms and things like that. But, this research seems to also point out that there's, patterns of use that can play, which we have a little bit more agency over. So I don't know if you have any. There's different ways to spin that because one is like advice for people, but in general, I don't know if you have some interesting ways you want to spin that conversation about
Yeah,
how we have
sure.
some control over this.
Yeah, no, I think honestly, this is the part that I like the most about the paper because I mean, I collected data in 2021, so it's almost 3 years ago now, and I suspect that maybe all of my main findings, just like how Twitter use relates to all those main dependent variables, might not be true anymore, just because the nature of Twitter now and how many iterations we had of the platform. But I do think that the more specific findings about what kinds of behaviors people can do on Twitter and how they relate to those outcome variables, not only I think they are relevant to Twitter, but maybe even relevant across other platforms. And most research on those different types of social media usage, they have mostly divided social media usage into passive or active. And although that strategies seem to be very fruitful at first, people were really finding that more passive types of usage were related to decrease in well-being, whereas for active, it wasn't that clear if it was actually just good or just irrelevant. Um, because people were operationalizing those things in such different ways, people were finding multitudes of results. And the way to escape that problem is that I just decided not to categorize anything into active or passive. I just try to understand how each specific behavior was related to changes in all my outcome variables and specific motivations for Twitter use. And so I try to have this, first of all, I try to create these two big categories, behaviors and functions. So one is more descriptive, like if I was observing someone using Twitter, I could just look at the behaviors they were doing, but the same behavior could be done for many different purposes. So maybe I am commenting on your post because, well, I want you to feel happy. So maybe I have like a social connection motivation, or maybe I'm commenting because I'm bored and I, just want to relieve my boredom. So this is what I mean when I talk about the function. Why exactly are you doing what you're doing? And I found that, at least in this sample, that scrolling down the feed was negatively related to well-being, which kind of supports that first finding from other researchers about how passive use seems to be more detrimental to users. I found that behaviors that are related to connecting to other people on Twitter, such as replying to other tweets or visiting other profiles, and even visiting the trending topics page, were related to sense of belonging. And I find this visiting the trending topics page an interesting one because that was also surprising to me. And I suspect that this might be the case because oftentimes the trending topics page has content from like large cultural in-groups. So whenever we consume that content, maybe we feel part of that large cultural in-group. And I also found that people who retweet more on average, and when I say on average, I'm saying that this is a between person relationship. So people who retweet more on average were also more polarized. So this is some of the interesting findings that I had for the specific behaviors that people could do on Twitter. But I also have some pretty interesting findings for the functions. So just like as a brief introduction, so it was a little bit tricky to define what the functions of Twitter would be. And we actually ended up doing like a little like scale development work for that because there were no like set categories for how to divide different motivations for Twitter use. And then after doing all that piloting, we found that people who use Twitter for escapism, so I'm frustrated with my work, I'm just going to use Twitter to escape whatever problem I have right now. That was related to decreased well-being. That was true at both levels of analysis, between and within levels. We also found that people who went to Twitter to look for information, so for the motivation of information seeking, were also ended up getting a little boost in outrage. And also that people that came to Twitter with the motivation for social interaction were on average high. On average, these people had higher sense of belonging. And another surprising finding that we had for polarization is that people who came to the platform for entertainment were somehow they had this within subjects increase in polarization, which was also a little bit puzzling to me. And I don't know to what extent, what explains that finding. Honestly, when I first saw that, my intuition was that maybe, like good, like all day, like internet trolls that they went to the internet to have fun, to just say whatever they wanted and to watch the circus burn. And that was my intuition when I saw the relationship between entertainment and polarization. But that's like how I'm trying to imagine that, because that's me speculating about the actual meaning of that relationship. But I guess those were the main findings from how people use Twitter and how those different types of usage relate to different outcomes for the users.
Yeah. So in addition to sort of potentially decreased well-being and potentially increased polarization and outrage, you also did, as you mentioned there a little bit, is this increased sense of belonging. Now, does that have a correlation to polarization? Because sometimes increased sense of belonging is more tribalness, right? More being more tribal. and those two might relate. Or in this case, you think that's a different thing?
Oh, that's such a good question. I don't think I've ever got that question before because people have definitely asked me if the sense of belonging was related to well-being, and I did that analysis, and that's definitely not the case.
Hmm.
But I didn't check that for outrage, but I'm trying to remember how exactly we asked about sense of belonging to see if that makes sense. And my guess will be not in the sense that the way we worded the questions of sense of belonging was way more focused on like the subjective feeling, like I feel like I belong to a community, I feel like I'm respected in a community, and it was a little bit less related to the outgroup, which I guess is part of the construct of sense of belonging, but not in the way that we measured it, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, like you say, like we were saying before, there's a lot of pieces here that make the whole situation a little more nuanced than it. People want nice and simple answers, but we don't always aren't always able to offer those in real life.
Yeah.
Um, the study also talks about these impersonal interactions and how those can have sort of a more positive impact on well-being. And again, I think I'm asking you to speculate here a little bit, but do you think that's because in real life interactions, we tend to tone it down a bit, especially when we're talking about polarizing topics like politics, or maybe there are other societal norms, or what do you think that's telling us?
Okay, that's a very good question. Um, so the reason why we, first of all, we even measure the effects of a social interaction on well-being is because we wanted to use that as a benchmark and not as like something we wanted to find out if it was true or not. So it was not necessarily a hypothesis. Uh, it was actually something so well established in psychology that social interactions are on average related to increased well-being, that we wanted to use that as a benchmark. And what I mean by that is I just wanted to see what was the magnitude of that relationship so that I could compare that magnitude against the magnitude of all other relations that I had. But I think the question you're posing is still very relevant in the sense that well, social media platforms were created with the promise of allowing us to socialize better and socialize more. And we actually don't know if they are actually accomplishing that function. And I suspect not, considering that we're not getting any of the effects that we get from in-person social interactions in a social media platform. Um, Although I don't think I have like spoken to that point directly. Uh, in the paper or in any of my presentations about that research project. But I think you raised an interesting point in there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good thing to know. I mean, that's an interesting direction. I don't know, but I guess speaking of that, where are you looking at taking this next?
Yeah. So I think there are two directions that I want to stretch this study to. In this project, I have also collected participants' Twitter data. So I have like the full content that they have tweeted while they were answering the surveys, and I also have the full content of their timelines while they were taking the surveys. Um, One of the directions that I want to go is I want to see if the valence of the content of their timeline, so if it's like a timeline with mostly positive content or negative content, if that had any effect on their mood throughout the week. So if I saw a lot of content on my timeline today, a lot of angry content, do I feel angrier by the end of the day? So that's one of the directions that I'm going with the study. Another direction that I have with the similar data set is so I have this cool data set where I collected data from Japanese participants and Canadian participants. But it was not limited to Twitter use, but social media use more generally. And I want to investigate if some cultural differences can maybe explain the kinds of psychological effects that people can get from social media use. So those are two of the ramifications that I already have from the project. But honestly, lately, I've been steering towards more like AI studies and less a little bit of social media because I feel like after doing the study, I realized how unpredictable that is. And what I mean by unpredictable is that we never know how soon your studies can become obsolete. Like how many people were doing research on Facebook 10 years ago, and how much of the research is actually useful today. So I'm a little bit scared in that sense. This is why I really like the direction that we took with the study of like actually figuring out how different behaviors relate to outcomes, because I feel like this is probably something that could be translated to different time points in history. But yeah, this is my sense now.
Interesting. Well, I don't know if you have developed any ideas for, or if you see any potential changes, in Twitter's design or algorithms that could, mitigate some of these negative effects.
Oh, that's a great question. Uh, I don't think I have been using Twitter very heavily recently, but I noticed some changes ever since Elon Musk took over. Um, and for one thing, it seems to me that Twitter is more similar to TikTok in considering a few features. So now Twitter has this For You page in which the algorithm is doing like a harder job at showing you things that you might find relevant. And what I find is that oftentimes it's more visual content than just written content. And we know that visual content has like a higher likelihood of going viral on Twitter. So content with like GIFs or images or videos. So I think that's changing the way people consume content on Twitter a little bit. But honestly, I don't know I couldn't possibly speculate to what direction that's leading people to. Because I could feel it both ways, because it's probably easier to manipulate people's intuitions and feelings with images and videos than with writing, right? And so if that content's still getting very political, then maybe people are even getting more polarized. But at least considering my timelines, I'm getting a lot of videos of puppies. So so I don't know if that will be definitely the case or not.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I guess that kind of takes us to, if you have any practical takeaways, for the audience of, from your research or based on your research, how to sort of become more responsible and sort of mindful on how they use Twitter and probably other platforms as well. But
Yeah. No, that's a great question. It's definitely, for me, it was definitely the case that I became more mindful about my own social media use after getting those results, because I am the kind of person who, when I start to get very frustrated, if I'm trying to do like statistical analysis and I'm getting a lot of errors, at some point I get tired and I'll open Twitter and I just scroll down. And that's probably not great for me. So I try to be more mindful in the sense that I try to plan my social media use ahead a little bit more, like for how long am I going to use, what period of the day, with what purpose. Because I do think that Twitter has a lot of interesting content, especially from academics. So that's where I learn about like new papers that people got published. Um, and so I guess that's the main thing, trying to be very mindful and also um, trying to interact with people more. Because I feel, and this is not only true for Twitter, at least I mean, it's also true for the other social media platforms that I consume, that oftentimes I'm just very passively using the social media, just scrolling down and seeing whatever people have. So whenever I can actually engage with people, like message people, comment on their posts, actually try to do that more mindfully. So I would say that that's two possible takeaways. Yeah.
oh, that's great. Well, Victoria, thank you so much for making time for our show and for those terrific insights.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.